As the 19th century turned into the 20th, New Zealand had been a British colony for a mere 6 decades, less than the course of a human lifetime. In that short period, its citizens had achieved a great many things of which they believed they could be proud. Stabilization of relations between Māori and Pākehā to the point where each people lived parallel lives in separate spheres. Functioning political and legal systems based on Westminster models. Near universal primary education. Transport and communications networks across a land characterized more by mountains and gorges than by plains. A viable meat, wool and dairy industry supplying the British market and generating national income, and social progress in such forms as votes for women, an industrial arbitration system, and pensions for the deserving elderly. The one thing the country had not yet done and was thirsting to do was send troops abroad to represent it in combat. There were old soldiers in New Zealand, most of them, Māori and Pākehā, veterans of the New Zealand Wars. There were others who had fought as imperial troops in earlier wars, in the Crimea in 1854 and in many other campaigns on the continents of Africa and Asia. One former officer who lived in New Zealand, Surgeon Captain Robert H. Blackwell, had worked at Florence Nightingale's shoulder at Balaclava. Another, Sergeant Major John Bevan of the Otago Mounted Police, had survived the charge of the Light Brigade. And Captain Henry Cecil Dudgeon Darcy, born in Wanganui, had won a Victoria Cross in the Zulu War of 1878-79. Not until the South African War broke out in October 1899 was a force raised in New Zealand and sent abroad specifically to represent the country in combat. In April of that year, Premier Richard John Seddon had offered the British government 500 troops to put down an uprising in Samoa, and Native Affairs Minister James Carroll, who had fought as a kupapa in the Te Kooti campaign, was keen to lead a 300-strong Maori contingent there. Parliamentary debates and newspaper editorials of the time convey the impression that sections of the country were bored with peacetime. 27 years had elapsed since the close of the war against Te Kooti and his followers. Members of the permanent militia and volunteer corps were keen to put their rugged training to practical test. The turn of the century and Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1898 were also generating nascent imperialism and nationalism. Patriotic men wanted to show their mettle in a scrap and to demonstrate the country's unswerving loyalty to Mother Britain, but at the same time to establish traditions and precedents that were New Zealand in origin and flavour. In the case of Samoa, to Seddon's and Carroll's disappointment, the British government declined offers of assistance. In the case of South Africa, 5 months later, Britain accepted. And the qualities which Seddon had identified as being advantageous for fighting on a Pacific island, European troops accustomed to bush warfare and bush life, and Maori warriors loyal, prepared and desirous of restoring law and order, might have seemed equally to be assets against the commando tactics of the Boers. New Zealand was the first colony to volunteer a contingent of mounted rifles for this war, and did so 2 weeks before war itself was declared. The first 200 troops and their horses were dispatched only 10 days after the declaration. At the send-off at the Wellington wharves, an enormous crowd heard Seddon proclaim that New Zealanders would fight for one flag, one queen, one tongue, and for one country, Britain. An onlooker wrote, "It was all magnificently fine. The heart of a young nation was going out in throbbing farewell to the flower of its youth, banded together at duty's call to fight for the motherland. The bands played, the people sang, and cheer after cheer was sent across the water. Women were weeping now, and there were even sober-sided businessmen whose eyes were just a trifle dim. The sloping sun gleamed on the waters, lit up the streaming flags, and fell upon the thousands of faces that watched as the 2 lines of steamers, with the troopship in the centre, went slow ahead down the harbour." 8 weeks later, the New Zealanders reached South Africa days ahead of the first Australian contingents, and they were in action in northern Cape Colony by the 9th of December. On the 28th of December, Private George Bradford of Paeroa became the first New Zealand soldier to die on overseas duty when he succumbed to wounds as a prisoner of war. His bandolier was recovered and later became the badge of office for successive presidents of the New Zealand-South African War Veterans Association. Each office holder would have his name inscribed on a chromium-plated .303 bullet case. The fundamental cause of the war, as military historian John Crawford has noted, was British determination to dominate South Africa and an equally strong Boer determination to resist the extinction of their independence. The trigger was the rights of Uitlanders, or non-Boers, in the Boer South African Republic, Transvaal. Most Uitlanders were English. They were denied votes and subject to forms of indirect taxation that they considered unjust. By 1899, many Uitlanders had abandoned their properties and possessions, and the Boers issued an ultimatum for the British to withdraw their troops from Transvaal. The Orange Free State aligned itself with Transvaal, and when the ultimatum expired, the British territories of Cape Colony and Natal were at war with the South African Republic, as was the British Empire as a whole. Richard Seddon was moved to offer New Zealand's participation not only on grounds of imperial solidarity, but also because many Uitlanders in Transvaal were gold miners of British stock, as he himself had been. He was profoundly moved by Britain's readiness to go to war in defence of a colonial community. Over 3 years, 1899 to 1902, New Zealand raised and dispatched 9 further contingents, the last 2 of which arrived too late to take part in significant action. In addition to providing their horses, volunteers were expected to take their own equipment, which cost about £25. The 3rd and 4th contingents were funded largely by public subscription, and the 5th to 10th by the British government. Altogether, New Zealand contributed nearly 6,500 men to the war effort and over £113,000 of public donations. From the outset, many Maori were keen to enlist for service in the war, but they were prevented from doing so as a contingent by a British government directive that blacks should not be deployed against whites. To some Maori this was a source of acute disappointment, and debate ensued over what precisely constituted black and white. Hui, such as one held at the Basin Reserve in Wellington on the 28th of March 1900, protested vigorously against the policy, but to no avail. Maori managed to enlist as individuals, however. Many, such as Barney Vercoe, Tom Porter, and Paki Withers, took advantage of European names and features. They served with distinction, and the experience stood some of them in good stead for promotion within the Pioneer Battalion in World War I, more than a decade later. As New Zealand's first war abroad, the South African campaign impressed itself vividly on the public imagination and provided cameos that were to become archetypical in the national mind. The spectacle of the rugged volunteer, for example, riding off to war with his own horse and equipment, was well captured by Dennis Glover in the poem I Remember, part of his Sings Harry sequence. Then Uncle Jim was off to the wars with a carbine at his saddle and was killed in the Transvaal, I forget in just what battle. Indeed, the Rough Riders, with their dusty mounts, bandoliers of bullets, weaponry and swaggering gait, evoked images every bit as romantic as those of the American frontier. The scenario in South Africa itself intensified the exotic conception people had of the theatre of war. Koppies, or small hills, overlooked barren, desert-like plains. The daytime temperatures soared, and the terrain lacked shade. It was an abrupt contrast with the luxuriant New Zealand landscape and temperate climate. Most New Zealanders found these conditions intensely unpleasant. For the first half of the war, the imperial and colonial forces concentrated on attacking the Boers' fixed positions, relieving towns besieged from the earliest days of combat, and in general engaging the enemy's army. The bulk of the action for the New Zealand contingents involved lightning attacks on the Boers' highly mobile units, especially later in the war when the major Boer armies had been defeated and remaining threats to security came from commando bands that were energetic, resourceful and difficult to engage. As might have been expected from their fitness and keenness, the New Zealand troopers, as they came to be called, fought with distinction. They were remembered especially for their part in actions at New Zealand Hill, Sanna's Post, Diamond Hill and Renosterkop. 1 in every 48 men received official recognition for distinguished or valuable services, and one trooper, Farrier Sergeant William James Hardham of Wellington, won the Victoria Cross. The number of New Zealanders killed in combat, 59, was relatively low, however. A larger total died from the combined effects of disease, 130, accidents, 30, and wounds. The accidental deaths included 16 New Zealanders killed in a train collision at Matavik on the 12th of April 1902. Back home in New Zealand, the mood throughout the war remained highly jingoistic. A booklet commemorating the country's contribution of troops and money identified their significance in these terms. It is a glorious page in our history. The whole nation is aroused, and the imperial spirit has taken a firm hold. If this war does nothing else than foster this feeling, it will not have been in vain. The little Englanders have hidden their diminished heads, party differences have been sunk in the common weal, and the united action of our vast empire has been an object lesson to the world. The old spirit of the mother is not lacking in the sons. In sparsely populated rural regions, such as the Coromandel Peninsula, parades of local volunteers and the unveiling of post-war monuments did a great deal to create and enhance special feelings of local identity and community cohesion. The Boer War was also in part responsible for the degree of nationalism that decisively ruled out the possibility of New Zealand's federating with the Australian colonies in 1901. The other face of jingoism was the strong intolerance of anybody who questioned or opposed New Zealand's support for the war. Only 5 members of the House of Representatives opposed the motion to send New Zealand troops, and only 1 member of the Legislative Council, Henry Scotland. If Britain were in danger, he would defend her, said the London-born Scotland. But she was not, and she was breaking a treaty to deprive the Boers of self-government. Newspapers of the day dismissed this viewpoint as arising from advanced senility. Another parliamentary employee, Hansard chief reporter J. Grattan Gray, was dismissed from his job for condemning the war in a letter to a newspaper. Employees of the Westport Harbour Board were threatened with the sack if they continued to voice reservations about the war. In addition to a record of distinguished performance in combat, New Zealand had begun to establish a tradition of harsh treatment of wartime dissenters. Surprisingly, perhaps, the troops at the front displayed less antagonism towards the Boers and less unqualified support for Mother Britain. Their literature and letters gave the South Africans credit for the manner in which they fought and for their considerate treatment of prisoners of war. Conversely, they showed a degree of contempt for some of the overly disciplined procedures of English soldiers, for their rigidly close fighting formations, and for some of the more ridiculous distinctions made between officers and men. On the home front, the public hero of the war was Lieutenant Colonel Alfred William Robin. Robin was not, as was widely supposed at the time, New Zealand born. He came from Victoria, Australia in his childhood. When at the age of 39 he was appointed commander of the first 3 contingents sent to South Africa, he became the first colonial anywhere to command a unit in defence of the British Empire. All his previous military experience had been in New Zealand, and more senior officers in New Zealand with Imperial Army training had opposed his appointment. He performed with great ability, however, in the relief of Kimberley, and at Driefontein, Johannesburg, and Diamond Hill. To the New Zealand public, he became a symbol of all that was worthy about the country's contribution to the war. He was given a hero's welcome in Dunedin when he returned home in May 1901. Later, he became Chief of the General Staff in New Zealand and the Commander of Home Forces in World War I. The South African War ended on the 31st of May 1902 with the signing of the Boer surrender at Potchefstroom. The experience of participation provided a hinge for New Zealand's military history, a link between past and future traditions. In a literal sense, it spanned the passage of the 19th century into the 20th, and of Victoria's reign into that of Edward VII, which began in 1901. This passage produced new precedents for New Zealanders. It established the principle that the country would involve itself in other parts of the world, and that it would do this to uphold British imperial power rather than simply to protect immediate national interests. There were, of course, elements of self-interest in addition to those of self-sacrifice. It was taken for granted that the Royal Navy would defend New Zealand's coastline if the country was threatened with invasion. Fortunately, this belief was never put to the test. The war was also the first in which New Zealand troops fought harmoniously alongside Australians, each recognising that they had more in common with one another than they did with British troops, thus laying the foundation for the Anzac connection that was to be cemented so strongly more than a decade later at Gallipoli and in North Africa during World War II. The traditions that grew up about New Zealand fighting men, rugged, enterprising, ready to throw away the rule book when the rules were inadequate, also originated in the South African War. Commentators noted that in many respects, especially in their capacity to handle horses and move rapidly and safely through rough country, New Zealand volunteers had shown themselves to be superior to British regulars. The Times history of the war in South Africa went so far as to say that, after they had gained some experience, the New Zealanders were, on average, the best mounted troops. Partly as a consequence of all this, the war also firmly established the New Zealand tradition of amateur soldiering. South Africa had shown that volunteers with minimum peacetime training could enlist in times of crisis and serve under professionals with verve and distinction. Once the war was over, these same men would return to civilian life and leave professional soldiering to a small clique of regulars. This, too, set a pattern for the next 50 years. Another effect of the South African War was to create in New Zealand a sharper interest in the broad questions of national and imperial defence. Richard Seddon, who developed a plan to federate Hawaii, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa and the Cook Islands into New Zealand, was allowed by the British government instead to annex the Cooks in 1901 and Niue in 1905, a gesture which could be interpreted as British gratitude for the country's contribution to the South African War. Seddon wanted Samoa too, but New Zealand's assumption of responsibility for part of that territory would have to await the defeat of Germany in World War I. There was nothing in New Zealand's early administration of these islands, through resident commissioners, that suggested a special gift for a colonial role. Sir Joseph Ward, when he became Prime Minister after Richard Seddon died unexpectedly in 1906, took up military and naval policies with a gusto that embarrassed some of his counterparts from other colonies. At both the Colonial Conference in London in 1907 and the Imperial Conference in 1911, he made some rash promises. One was to offer Britain 2 battleships to be paid for by New Zealand, only one of which, HMS New Zealand, would actually be built. Another was to provide a blueprint for an Imperial Parliament of Defence, a proposal rejected by other Prime Ministers. The message was clear, however. New Zealand expected the Empire as a whole to be prepared for future international conflict, and it wanted to share in both the planning and conduct of future wars. Implicit in all this was the conviction that the Empire as a whole would never put a foot wrong in matters of principle and foreign affairs, and that anyone who crossed Mother Britain was likely to be wrong, and did so at their peril. A pamphlet popular in New Zealand at the time preached that the genius of the British race is rooted in justice, truth, honour and consideration for the rights of others. The continued exercise of these principles has given virility to the race. Another reiterated the New Zealander's double patriotism, that of his own country and the wider patriotism of the great empire to which he is proud to belong. With such principles emphatically in view, the Liberal government passed the 1909 Defence Act, which established a territorial force recruited from compulsory military training. It was designed to create an adequate system of national self-defence and to allow the country to mobilise rapidly in the event of empire-wide emergencies. The first of those emergencies occurred in 1914. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in June, a system of alliances and rapid mobilizations pitted the Central Powers, Austria-Hungary and Germany, against the Franco-Russian alliance. And when Germany swept into Belgium in order to outflank France, thus violating Belgium's neutrality, King George V, who had replaced his father, Edward VII, in 1910, declared on the 4th of August 1914 that Britain and the British Empire were at war with the Central Powers. While the invasion of Belgium was the trigger, the real motive for British intervention was an attempt to prevent Germany dominating Europe. Few New Zealanders understood this sequence of events, but most welcomed the fact that the country, as part of the empire, was now at war with Germany. It seemed that at last an opportunity had arrived to put to the test the virtues and the preparations of the previous decade. John A. Lee remembered the climate of the time. "I was walking through the country, and the people cheered. You could understand it. A long period of what was comparative prosperity, no great events happening for a long time. Everybody rushed, of course, to enlist. That was the spirit. Folks sang patriotic songs and they cheered. They talked about the great sacrifices of young men that would be made." It was left to the parliaments of the individual dominions to decide the extent of their contributions to the war. New Zealand legislators, led by the bluff Northern Irishman William Massey, had no doubts about the need to be involved in the war. In addition to imperial sentiment, they were influenced by the fact that New Zealand's prosperity rested on its market in Britain and the need to keep the sea trade routes open. They offered the British an expeditionary force on the 5th of August, and the offer was accepted by telegraph on the 12th of August. Volunteers were called for from the territorials, and these men went into intensive training under professional officers at camps in the four main centres. On the 15th of August, a 1,400-strong advance party of troops sailed for German-occupied Samoa, and at this point some of the less than satisfactory aspects of New Zealand's preparation for war became apparent. When the New Zealand government asked the Colonial Office in London about German forces in Samoa, Sir Lewis Harcourt cabled back, "See Whitaker's Almanac." A search of the almanac revealed nothing about Samoan defences. In addition, the convoy carrying the troops may have passed within 25 kilometres of cruisers which were part of the German East Asiatic Squadron. The operation was successful nonetheless, and the New Zealand commander accepted a German surrender in Samoa on the 29th of August. It was the first Allied occupation of German territory in the war. The remainder of the initial expeditionary force, some 8,500 men and 3,800 horses, continued training under the overall direction of Major General Sir Alexander John Godley. Godley, a nephew of John Robert Godley, one of the founders of the Canterbury settlement, was an English professional soldier on loan to New Zealand to supervise the reorganisation of the country's defence forces. At the outbreak of war, he became General Officer commanding the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, whose main body of troops sailed from Wellington on the 16th of October. At this point, it was envisaged that the New Zealanders would be taken to France to counter the German advance along the Western Front. But the entry of the Ottoman Empire into the war on the side of the Central Powers changed the strategic picture, and the convoy of New Zealand troops and the Australians who had joined them en route disembarked instead in Egypt to complete training there and, if necessary, defend that country from Turkish attack. On the 3rd of February 1915, 2 months after their arrival, New Zealanders went into action for the first time. A Turkish force that had trekked across the Sinai Desert launched an attack on the Suez Canal at Ismailia. The Nelson Company of the Canterbury Infantry Division filled a gap in the canal defences and repulsed the attack with the assistance of Indian troops. The Turks suffered heavy losses, the Imperial forces only 18, of whom one, Private William Arthur Ham of Canterbury, died of wounds, thus becoming New Zealand's first casualty in the war. The greater part of the expeditionary force's early time in Egypt was spent in training at Zaytun Camp near Cairo. Men ran up sandhills with heavy loads, dug and filled in trenches, and launched mock bayonet attacks. They were joined by steady waves of reinforcements from New Zealand, including a 439-strong Maori contingent, and they were linked in training with a combination of Australian brigades and divisions, thus forming the Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC. Before going into action together against the enemy, however, the Australians and New Zealanders turned on some of their Egyptian hosts on Good Friday 1915 in the so-called Battle of the Wazza. This was a riot in one of Cairo's more notorious streets in which several hundred troops set fire to brothels while thousands more looked on. The action was allegedly taken in retaliation for 3 grievances: bad alcohol, it was rumoured that the suppliers urinated in it to make it go further, a rise in prices, and the isolation of troops with venereal disease in special compounds. An official inquiry failed to identify any individuals responsible, but Australian witnesses claimed that New Zealanders had been more heavily involved than they had. 3 weeks later, the war began in earnest for New Zealanders. The Anzacs were transported to Lemnos in the Aegean Sea and from there to Gallipoli for a major assault on the Dardanelles, the Hellespont of the ancient world. This operation, planned by British First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, was designed to open the straits to the British and French navies to allow an attack on Constantinople and thus relieve Turkish military pressure on Russia. The area, the boundary between Europe and Asia, was renowned for heroic battles. Troy had stood on the Asian side near the entrance to the straits, and Xerxes had built his bridge of floats over the narrows in the 5th century BC to mount the Persian invasion of Greece. From the outset, however, the Anzac part of the Gallipoli campaign went terribly wrong. The spearhead troops ahead of them were landed 3 kilometres north of the planned landing place. When the Anzacs followed them ashore at what came to be called Anzac Cove at around 9 a.m. on the 25th of April, they encountered almost sheer cliffs instead of climbable slopes, and the Turkish Army's 19th Division, commanded by Mustafa Kemal Bey, later known as Kemal Atatürk, the founder and father of the post-war Turkish Republic. The combination of obstacles proved insurmountable. The Australian and New Zealand losses were high. 1 in 5 of the 3,000 New Zealanders who landed that day became casualties. It was all the troops could do to dig in on the slopes and prevent themselves being driven back into the sea. Hold the position they did, however, for what became a prolonged stalemate of equally balanced forces. Trooper Gordon Harper of Christchurch wrote to his family on the 15th of May, "The hillside is studded with dugouts, and like an ant-heap, swarming with men, and the foreshore piled up with stores and ammunition. The whole time on the ridges on either side of us, the terrific fusillade keeps up without ceasing, almost impossible to hear oneself speak. Across the sea is the rugged island of Imbros, and near it a huge mountain island, Samothrace, rising sheer out of the sea, behind which the sun sets, and provides us with many beautiful sights. It is a strangely peaceful setting for the horrors of war. those green hills and fields, red and yellow with poppies and wildflowers, and the blue Aegean coming right to their feet. As the weeks went by with no essential change in positions, conditions deteriorated until they were as close to hell as men could conceive, living, as one New Zealander said, like dirty rabbits in cramped trenches and dugouts. Anzacs and Turks, Ian McGibbon wrote, faced each other sometimes only metres apart in a state of increasing discomfort. Searing heat and the swarming flies, made worse by unburied corpses in no man's land, tormented the men, conditions exacerbated by water shortages. Disease, especially dysentery, flourished in the insanitary conditions among men already debilitated by weeks of inadequate food. These physical problems were compounded by the psychological pressures stemming from the consciousness that no place in the tiny perimeter was safe from artillery fire. With the Turks overlooking them, snipers, too, were an ever-present hazard. The position was not a great deal more favourable for the English, French and Indian troops on other parts of the peninsula, except that they were not dug in on slopes as precipitous. Several assaults were planned in an attempt to break the deadlock. In one, in May, on flatter terrain near Cape Helles to the south, the New Zealand Brigade lost 800 men in what was described as an ill-conceived attack across a notorious piece of ground known as the Daisy Patch. The other major Allied offensive in August 1915 was an attempt to push troops to the summit of the peninsula and open the way for attacks on Turkish positions on the Dardanelles side. This, too, was a costly failure. New Zealand troops, led by Lieutenant Colonel William Malone and his Wellington Regiment, captured the ridge of Chunuk Bair on the 8th of August, the furthest point inland reached in the whole campaign. But it was lost to a massive Turkish counterattack on the 10th of August, and Malone and most of his men died. One New Zealander, an Auckland bank clerk named Cyril Bassett, a signaller, won a Victoria Cross for his part in the Chunuk Bair action. According to other survivors, numerous deeds of collective and individual heroism went unrewarded because the officers who could have written citations became casualties. By December 1915, the Allied forces were no closer to clearing the Dardanelles than when they landed 8 months before. If anything, they were further from that objective because of the subsequent reinforcement of Turkish positions. Worse, the Turks had brought in heavier artillery capable of demolishing even the strongest Allied positions. The extreme heat of summer had given way to punishing winter conditions, which included a massive blizzard that covered the New Zealand positions with ice and snow in late November. It was no surprise when the order to evacuate was given in mid-December. It was carried out secretly and virtually without casualties, and was the only aspect of the campaign that could be called successful. The debacle of the campaign as a whole, however, the fault of the planners and the strategists, not the frontline troops, made it imperative that something by way of positive achievement be salvaged from the carnage. Over 400,000 British and 79,000 French troops had been committed to the assault. Half of these became casualties. The cost to New Zealand was 2,721 dead and 4,752 wounded, out of a total of 8,450 men, a staggering 88% casualty rate. The remains of those killed were left there. Many were never found. Historian John North wrote, "It may be doubted whether in the whole history of war an army has ever been called upon to endure severer strain. They were everlastingly fighting with their backs to the sea. They were in complete isolation. No one could ever expect relief or rest. Every man felt condemned to stay there until death, wounds or sickness overtook them, and the world does find it difficult to remember so large a debt of suffering." For the New Zealand and Australian public at home, the experience of Gallipoli had also been traumatic. It was the first time lengthy casualty lists were published in the newspapers. On top of this was the inconceivable fact that the Allies had been defeated. The effect of this double tragedy on two countries of small populations was to make the experience sacred. Only in that way could such a vast human sacrifice be made comprehensible and acceptable. Anzac Day, the 25th of April, was established as an annual day of commemoration. For the next 3 generations it would be the focal point of national mourning for all wars and for expressions of patriotism. The necessary myth evolved quickly in both countries that they had come of age on the slopes of Gallipoli. Fred Waite, official historian of the New Zealand contribution, put it this way: "Before the war we were an untried and insular people. After Anzac we were tried and trusted. But at what frightful cost." It was thought by troops at the time that nothing in warfare would equal the rigours and the horrors of Gallipoli, but that was because they did not know of the squalor that awaited them on the Western Front in France and Belgium. And in April 1916, New Zealand soldiers were committed to that battlefield for another round of carnage, this one lasting 2.5 years. In the lines of trenches that ran, in effect, from the North Sea to Switzerland, troops encountered swamp-like mud, snow and ice in winter, frightful slaughter in the course of offensives such as those at Passchendaele and the Somme, the stench of unburied men and horses, and new refinements in technological barbarity such as poison gas. Advances, on the rare occasion that they occurred, were measured in hundreds of metres. In 4 years of Allied effort, the front moved no more than 100 kilometres. There, as in Gallipoli, New Zealanders took a full share in the fighting, and a full share of the casualties that would so baffle and anger the post-war world. At the Somme in September 1916, 1,560 New Zealanders died. At Messines in June 1917, 3,700 casualties. In October 1917, at Passchendaele, in the space of a few hours, the New Zealand Division lost 640 men killed and 2,100 wounded. It was slaughter on a scale unprecedented in human history, and, considering the negligible result, utterly wasteful. Other New Zealanders had returned to the Middle East after Gallipoli, and they were part of Allied forces that pushed the Turks out of Egypt and Palestine over the next 3 years. They included the New Zealand Mounted Rifles, the last of the country's troops to go to war and fight on horseback. They lost 500 men killed and 1,200 wounded. Back home, the prevailing jingoism and the pain experienced by bereaved families combined to generate intense hostility towards those suspected of being shirkers or disloyal. People of German descent were treated badly, butchers' shops were wrecked, barbers forced to close their premises, and in Christchurch, the bells of the Lutheran Church were smashed. Many continental European immigrants, especially the Dalmatians from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were interned as aliens. Even the Tainui Māori leader, Te Puia Herangi, was ostracized because of distant German ancestry. Treatment of conscientious objectors was also harsh. When a national register was taken in 1915, men of military age were asked to declare whether they were willing to do military service. Of the 196,000 eligible, 33,700 said they would not undertake service of any kind, and 44,300 were willing to serve only at home. While a proportion of these would have been malingerers, a large number were men of principle and integrity who could not accept the morality of war in any circumstances, especially a war fought 20,000 kilometres away and offering no immediate threat to New Zealand's security. Unless they belonged to a church, the tenets and doctrines of which declare the bearing of arms and the performance of combatant service to be contrary to divine revelation, they had no grounds for exemption once conscription was introduced in August 1916. Hundreds of genuine conscientious objectors were imprisoned and subjected to physical and dietary punishments in an effort to make them relent. They were also deprived of civil rights, including the right to vote, for 10 years. Half a dozen, including Archibald Baxter, who wrote a moving anti-war memoir, We Will Not Cease, was shipped to the Western Front and exposed to fire and to a series of barbaric field punishments. In Waikato, Te Puia Herangi led a campaign of passive resistance against Maori conscription, which had been imposed on Waikato Maniapoto tribes only. Police raided her headquarters at Mercer 4 times and arrested nearly 200 of her followers. Maori from most other areas, apart from Taranaki, had enlisted willingly, however. They took part in combat at Gallipoli and formed a pioneer battalion of sappers in France. For a country of its size, a population of less than 1 million in 1914, the New Zealand contribution to World War I was massive. Nearly 20% of the eligible manpower was recruited. Of all the Allied countries, only Britain's proportion was higher. The number sent overseas was over 100,000, and of these nearly 17,000 were killed and more than 41,000 wounded. In cities, towns and villages across the country, war memorials went up to list those killed. Scarcely a surname was not represented, and some small communities lost their entire crop of young manhood, some families all their sons. As one historian commented, the next generation did not need to be told that the angel of death had passed over the land. They had heard the beating of its wings. Anzac Day, marking the anniversary of that first Australian and New Zealand landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula at dawn on the 25th of April 1915, was the occasion that both countries chose to commemorate all their dead from the war, and, subsequently, from all wars. As Ian McGibbon has noted, the high casualty rate and eventual failure of the Dardanelles campaign served only to enhance its sanctity in the public mind. In New Zealand, after persistent lobbying by the Returned Soldiers Association, later the Returned Services Association, the day was declared a public holiday in 1920 and Sundayized, meaning that shops and hotels would be closed, in 1922. A ritual for the day evolved from the standard military funeral. It would begin with the dawn parade, a march of former servicemen in the early morning darkness to the local war memorial. Members of the wider community would join them there, but with pride of place given to the veterans. Then would follow a short service, prayers, hymns, and a dedication, concluding with the final verse of Lawrence Binyon's poem, For the Fallen. The last post would be played, followed by a minute's silence. For all New Zealanders who attended these ceremonies over the succeeding decades, the element that carried most reverberation was the Binyon dedication. And participants would disperse, thoughtfully, with the words of that dedication still suspended in the early morning air. They shall not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them.